Good afternoon and welcome to the Nelson A. Rockefeller Institute of Government. I am Bob Bullock, Deputy Director for Operations for the Institute. On behalf of our Board of Overseers and staff, it is a pleasure to have you here today for what we know will be an important forum which brings together some of the most knowledgeable authorities in the state and nation on the subject of fraud, waste, and abuse. Before we begin our program, I would like to ask you to please all silence your cell phones. Programs like this can only occur because of the efforts of visionary collaborators. In that regard, I would like to acknowledge our partners in this venture, Brian Burke from the Center for Technology and Government, and Teresa Pardo, its director, and Ariel Bernstein of the internationally prominent data analytics firm SAS. Your program today will include a keynote and 2 panels. Questions and answers may be asked at the conclusion of our panels, and questions of our keynote may be directed to our speaker as part of the Panel 1 question and answer period. Here to begin our program is one of the nation's foremost authorities on fraud, waste, and abuse, and the former Assistant Director of the FBI, Mr. Chris Swecker. Chris?
First, let me just make a couple quick caveats. At the beginning of all of my talks, I usually try to tell the audience I have a very depressing effect on audiences because I'm not talking about the most uplifting topic in the world. So, you know, most of what I say today will involve fraud, abuse, and I'll use the word fraud quite a bit, because I think there's a good amount of fraud out there. In fact, I'm going to throw a zinger out from the very start and say I think fraud and financial crimes is probably the most dominant crime problem and the most profitable crime model that exists in this country today. And with all due deference to violent crime, drug trafficking, and all those terrorism, etc., I think this is the type of crime that's most likely to hit just everyday individuals like us. For example, in all of my audiences, I ask the question at the very outset, how many of you or someone you know or someone close to you has experienced some type of financial crime as a victim? Credit card fraud, checking account fraud, identity theft? How many? Just a quick show of hands. Yeah, usually about 50, sometimes 2/3 of the audience, hands go in the air. I included myself as well. My credit card has been compromised 3 times. And I'm supposed to be an expert in this area. So it is, to me, it's the most profitable crime model out there. We pay the price in so many different ways. Some are direct costs of, repairing your identity theft, dealing with credit card fraud, the time and expense of it all. Other costs are indirect. You pay more in premiums. Taxpayer funds are wasted. So. And I think a lot of the what we call fraud, abuse, or improper payments is organized criminal activity. Maybe a better word for it is network criminal activity. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is a very fundamental aspect of what you deal with every day, and that is, who are we dealing with? We have to know who this adversary is. And we have to know ourselves as well. I always start with the Sun Tzu quote. Most people have heard it. It's basically know your enemy, right? But the real quote and the punchline of the quote is, if you don't know your enemy and if you don't know yourselves and you don't match yourselves appropriately with your adversary, you're going to lose. And my premise today is that we have a very formidable adversary out there, and we're not matching up very well against that adversary. You know, this problem ranges from opportunistic abuse to professional criminal activity. And I would not to say that the opportunistic crime isn't taking place. Somebody might be claiming an extra deduction on their tax return or fudging on their, to qualify for government benefits in some way. But I don't think that's the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem that you're facing is networked criminal activity. That's where the biggest losses come from, and I'll give you some illustrations of that as we move through. But first of all, that in going along with the theme of the Sun Tzu quote, knowing ourselves, we are the good guys. That's our disadvantage. I spent 25 years in the FBI, 3 years at Bank of America. I spent some as head of security, and I spent some time as a prosecutor. We're encumbered by rules and regulations. Of course, the bad guys are not. We're SIUs, we're program integrity, we conduct investigations, technology comes into play, audit, inspector generals, all of that. The issue there is, as I'll talk about in just a second, is we're very siloed. Big surprise to people who, and you know, one of my biggest surprises when I came out of the government, the intelligence community, the federal law enforcement community, was as an expert in silos. I think that qualifies me as an expert in silos coming from that area, because I thought nothing was more compartmentalized than the government sector, especially law enforcement and the intelligence community. I got to Bank of America and I saw more silos in that large institution, more data silos, more component silos than I had seen in the federal government. We're extremely compartmentalized. And most of our programs are the old pay and chase, right? We get these benefits out, we get the payments out, and then we chase down the fraud later. Very little real-time detection activity is taking place. Some is, but I find when I teach at, for example, the Medicaid Integrity Institute down in South Carolina, and I talk to the analysts who are actually doing the work, they tell me that they're in a very manual environment for the most part. Very heavily reliant on tips, and occasionally we'll use electronic detection systems, what I call the tripwires, based on rules, based on anomalies, based on some type of analysis of the claims and the account enrollments as they move through the system. We set thresholds, and bad guys know that, of course. The ones that I'm talking about, the professionals are constantly probing those thresholds to see where they are. We, of course, have resource limitations. Nobody's storing resources in this area. We're a cost center. We're not a profit part of the business. We're not part of the core business, if you will. And that goes across the board, whether it's a financial institution, a government agency, or an insurance company. So, you know, nobody's throwing resources in your direction. We're constantly forced to prioritize the work that we do. Unfortunately, though, operating in a system like this, we sort of play right directly into the strengths of the bad guys. They understand the thresholds, they understand our resource limitations, and more importantly, they understand that we don't link up disparate activities. We're generally taking the next tip or the next case in the queue and we're working it. So this case might be a $5,000 loss case. The next, or 15 cases up in the queue, there might be a case related to a $10 million loss. So, but it takes the same amount of resources to work a $5,000 case as it would that $10, $15 million case. And the disadvantage that we're at is they understand that we're not making the links to see the broader activity. So we're taking these cases one at a time. When we're taking them, what we're doing, what I call detection without context. We take a case, we take an alert, we take a tip, and manually we can broaden that out and see the broader criminal activity that's taking place. We might see, you know, a huge crime ring, but it's going to take you a long time to build that out, and it's going to take a very special investigator or analyst to do that. So what we do, this concept of big ear, little brain, I heard it on NPR after 9/11. You know, and I lived through 9/11. I was in the FBI at the time. The general theme is that we missed it. There was a lot of information laying around in a lot of different places. We had tons of data in all these different agencies, and even within these agencies, we had databases and components within agencies that didn't share that data. Now, this wasn't the fault of an individual analyst or an individual agent. It was a system that was set up that did not enable those good agents and analysts to make links and see broader activity that was taking place. So we were taking in all that data, but we failed to analyze, you know, and consolidate and analyze that data and see the broader picture. We do the same thing, I think, in fraud detection and in the fraud environment, or the anti-fraud environment. So who are they? I mean, we have talked a little bit about our shortcomings, if you will, or our vulnerabilities. I think there's a crime paradigm that changed, or the whole crime paradigm changed back when the wall came down in 1989. I was working organized crime at the time. You know, back in those days, it was all about drug trafficking cartels. It was about the families. There were some 30-some-odd crime families. Everybody thinks of the 5 families in New York, but there were about 30-plus La Cosa Nostra families operating. There were any number of criminal syndicates out there, but the one group that sort of, after the fall of the wall, if you will, in about 1990 or so, a new crime paradigm emerged, and it was based around financial crimes. The Russians came. The Eastern Europeans came. They hit Brighton Beach, and think about the types of criminals that we're dealing with here. These were criminals that operated behind the curtain in a black market environment. And this was a black market environment that was not only tolerated by the KGB and the FSA and the Russian Soviet Union government, but they were enabled by it because they needed that black market system. Incredibly savvy criminals, very knowledgeable tradecraft, what I call tradecraft, understanding how to surveil a system and understand the weaknesses in the system, very business-oriented. So these individuals and these crime groups sort of swept across Europe and into the U.S., hit Brighton Beach, New York, in the early 90s, and established a foothold. And to me, they invented and perfected some of the financial crimes that we're talking about and we're facing. You're right in the epicenter of it. Healthcare fraud, SNAP fraud, different variations of insurance fraud. So when the wall came down, that launched an entirely new crime paradigm. And this financial crime as an industry, I think, dwarfs all other crime categories. If you look at, I took the most conservative numbers that I could put my hands on from some fairly credible organizations, and try to take it down even further and be more conservative. And if you look at it from this perspective, just these crime categories, these financial crime categories total up to about $620 billion. And drug trafficking industry is about 30 to 40 billion. The La Cosa Nostra on their best day wouldn't even come close to these numbers. So what we're talking about is crime as an industry, crime perpetrated by professionals who know how to exploit the system, and they do it very efficiently and on a mass scale. I just throw this quote in there because I think it's very appropriate. These are people who have no fear of our criminal justice system, and in many cases, they don't even have to subject themselves to the jurisdiction of the U.S. criminal justice system. A lot of these crimes that they perfected, you can commit remotely, even in the government benefits area, as we move more and more aggressively into the electronic environment. Digital benefits, electronic benefit cards, you name it. Electronic medical records. Many of them are former government officials. Just for grins, go on this website. It's www.russianmafiacards.com. Just like in Iraq, I was there in Iraq in '03. They had the cards, the deck of cards. Well, this is the deck of cards of the Russian mafia. And just to give you an example, this is the guy on your right there is a former minister of finance. Simen Mogilevich, #1 on the top 10 FBI fugitive list, living in Moscow in plain sight, owned a bank up in Canada. And you have to work really hard to get on the FBI's top 10 list as a white-collar criminal, but he is probably the #1 fugitive on the FBI's top 10 list. But very savvy former government and very savvy in the financial world. This is one of the first guys that landed in Brighton Beach. He invented a scam called the daisy chain fraud. It revolved around fuel excise tax. Couldn't begin to explain the fraud to you right now, but the theme or the idea is that most of their focus is in financial crimes. And I'm speaking broadly about what they now call transnational Eurasian organized crime. They perfected the staged accident crime category. If you go on the National Insurance Crime Bureau's website, you will see that staged accidents are the #1 PIP fraud category in the insurance industry. Perfected it. The reason I bring up this particular character is you look at the scope and the breadth of these fraud schemes. 400 million in claims. This went on for years and years. What we're doing, what the insurance industry was doing, was detecting fraud in little nodes, like I talked about earlier. Looking at the fraud a single fraud in a vacuum, and they just weren't able to connect up the fraud. They've since put together a group of 200 analysts who spend, this is on the National Insurance Crime Bureau's website if you want to look at it, 200 analysts that spend all their time, all day, every day, analyzing the insurance claims database. So all the insurance companies have pooled their data together. Another, a good example, I think one of the better examples of a consortium approach to fraud, which I think government agencies can use as well. They pooled their claims data and they run analytics across that claims data looking for fraud rings. And guys like this. They also, then they moved on to healthcare fraud, which I think is probably the single largest fraud category that I know of outside of maybe trade fraud. And trade fraud is a very complex crime. It's very lucrative, but this is a huge fraud category. And the reason I bring up this case, of course, is that you recognize some of the folks up there. That's Jan Fedorchik from the FBI talking about, and Ray Kelly behind her, talking about the largest Medicaid, Medicare takedown in the history of Medicaid and Medicare. It was a Russian Armenian ring. The ringleader was in New York, Arman Khazarian. The reason I bring up cases like this is because this case has, there's a staggering figure there, even by current standards, when you have to have $1 billion to get anybody's attention. But 163 million in billings. This scheme went on for 6 or 8 years. So again, we're detecting the fraud in little nodes, but we're not seeing the broader fraud activity. Then again, this was October 2010, touted as the largest takedown in the history of healthcare, or these types of cases. Look at what he did. 118 health clinics, 25 states, postal addresses. What I'm going to talk about in just a minute, and I hope I don't run out of time here, is how we can use some of these analytical tools, the analytical firepower that's available out there to make these links so that you can link those 118 health clinics, because bad guys are inherently lazy right now. We're not making those links. We're looking at it out of context and in a vacuum. We'll detect a node here and a node there and a node there. And that allows them to continue to hemorrhage the system until they just get tired of doing it. But it's interesting, over the next 2 years, you saw 3 other cases come down that were touted as the largest Medicare, Medicaid fraud cases in the history of those programs. 91 indictments, 20 indictments, 73 indictments. Huge fraud rings, huge dollar amounts, long periods of time. So without running the risk of swinging after the bell, there is a system that's not matching well. Our system is not matching well with this type of adversary. These are professionals, and they're linked in many ways and we'll talk about the types of links that you can make to show the broader criminal activity. As an organized crime investigator, when we launched an investigation, the first thing you did was we didn't call it that at the time, we tried to figure out the social network of this particular organized crime group. They're a malignant social network. But it took a lot of time back then, because you went to the corporation records, you went into driver's license records, you went into telephone records, you went into financial records, and you tried to piece it all together. And what you're really doing, though, what we were really doing was looking at a social network. And we need to get better at looking at and finding and identifying these malignant social networks. And guys like this, I throw this one in there just for grins, because here, again, this is New York. He's from Brighton Beach. He's a Russian. And you can see what he thinks of the system. He's been caught, but he's not too worried about it. 85 procedures in 20 months on one patient. That didn't get picked up, by the way, by the system. That must have hurt. But that didn't get picked up by the system. It got picked up from a tip, which is a fine way. That's a good way to initiate cases. But to me, it's not a systematic way of going about your business. It relies on manual procedures. It relies on the initiative of investigators and analysts, which we have no shortage of. They're good at what they do, but if you ever sit down and watch what they do and how they do it, they're jumping from screen to screen to screen, looking at this disparate database and this database and this database. So it's not a systemic way of going at the problem. And I will say too, this is also an area where you can't arrest your way out of the issue. you're in the best position. If you're in this field and you're in the industry itself, whether it's a government agency, a bank, an insurance company, you're closer to the action than law enforcement. You're there where the transactions are occurring, the claims are occurring, the account enrollment is taking place. Law enforcement is a bit further downstream. You're in a better position to actually directly impact. And the theme of this entire day is detection and prevention. After something has happened is not the time to spike the ball in the end zone. After we've lost $300 million. The real test here is, can we prevent it? Can we detect it real time? Can we do something about it and mitigate it and actually stop fraud before it even happens? Everybody knows that the internet crime has become a huge, huge issue. Again, this was perfected by the Eastern Europeans. Romania, other countries in the former satellite states are ground zero for internet-based fraud. They're the best at it. They're the most prolific. If you look at the Verizon report, which is a very good report, comes out every year. They did a study of it. They showed that 67% of these internet intrusions come from Eastern Europe. And I think that's a fairly low figure. And just to sort of give you a sense of the scope of what one guy can do, for example, this was Alberto Gonzalez, who I worked a case involving Alberto back in 1999 before he became the most prolific hacker that we know about, aided by 4 Russians. He hit just about every business there is out there, stealing credit card and personally identifiable information. South Carolina got hit. And when I spoke in South Carolina with some of my SAS friends, right after they got hit, and I had dinner with the comptroller, and I said, let me just guess. You've done some forensic work on this, and it was an Eastern European hacker. And he said, how'd you know that? It's just a good guess. Most of this happens through phishing. Most of these intrusions happen through some sort of phishing exploit or spear phishing exploit, and most of you know what that is. Somebody in the agency has been targeted, usually somebody fairly high profile, with a very well-placed email ostensibly coming from someone you know well. It has a link. You click on the link. The malware comes on your computer. It's basic key logging technology, and every keystroke you make is captured remotely in Romania, wherever they're doing it from. Quite a few business accounts stolen, 676,000 business tax returns taken. I think there were like somewhere around 6 million individual tax returns taken. And I just extrapolated out the average account takeover, about $212,000 in losses. If only a small percentage of those records are actually exploited, you can get up to about $212 million in losses plus the litigation expenses and mitigation expenses. It can add up very quickly. Texas got hit as well. Other states have been hit. I guess the main point about this whole internet thing is we are getting into that electronic environment. Crime in this area is viral, like everything else on the internet. You can go into if you know how to get into the dark web, deep dark corners of the web, you can get on these sites where they'll sell you credit card numbers, beneficiary numbers, provider IDs, a botnet, money mules, a franchise of money mules, people who will go out and actually monetize the data. That you can get a skimming device. Pretty much anything you want or need if you want to commit fraud, the knowledge of how to commit the fraud, knowledge of the system, that's all for sale in these deep, dark corners of the internet. They're very nimble, and they're very well networked. And this is an area where they don't hold things close. They don't hold the information close like we do, because it's better to create noise in the environment. So they're happy to get other fraudsters in the game. It creates a lot of noise in the system, and it makes it a lot easier for them to commit fraud. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes? Okay. Better get to the solution, huh? So we are playing a game of whack-a-mole. I mean, it's a very frustrating game. I was very frustrated when I got to Bank of America. I knew from my perch as head of the criminal division of the FBI that fraud rings were active internationally in just about every financial, industry there that we were dealing in. Banks, insurance, healthcare, government benefits, etc. But everybody is playing this game. What we should be doing is we should be going after the broader networked criminal enterprises first and foremost. You only do that by doing linking and doing network analysis. We should be going after the high-value frauds and the smaller rings, if you will. And only last should we spend our resources on the opportunistic, singular, one-off type of activities. I understand we have to do some of that, but with the resources that we have, it's not the most efficient way to go about the business that we're in. I'm going to skip over the next couple of slides in the interest of time. I mean, you look at some of the government benefit programs. SNAP is a big one. SNAP is getting hammered by what I call clustered or group activities. I threw up some case examples there. You only have about 40 inspectors to oversee about 400,000 merchants. You can go Google SNAP fraud, TANF fraud, food stamp fraud, and you'll bring up these cases. They're happening all across the country, but they're happening in clusters. It's a group of stores, very cash-centered type of businesses. It's a certain type of business, and if you get one and you do some homework or you do some analysis, the whole house of cards will fall. I mean, you will see the other activities and how they're related together. This was an interesting indictment. It had some undercover conversations that took place, and just one guy was just teaching the undercover agent how to commit food stamp fraud and where the vulnerabilities were. And of course, the Medicaid millionaires. This was one case where these were very wealthy individuals living in a condo complex, and they were getting certain government benefits. Of course, you qualify only with a certain type of profile, the economic profile. Well, their economic profile at this address was off the charts. So just some simple linking of addresses would have surfaced some of this activity. We focus on the what, we focus on the behavior, we don't focus on the who. I think if we spend more time focusing on the who, then we start to get into the realm of identifying the networks. We need to do real-time detection. Most of our detection takes place very, very far down the road in terms of time sequence. We do batched. If we do any type of electronic detection, it's usually batched information, and it's usually limited databases. Very seldom do we consolidate databases and look across some of these silos, although the bad guys, of course, are agnostic to the silos. We should be prioritizing the linked activities. I call them money mules. Mules are the weak link. The people that actually enroll for the benefits, the people that actually monetize the information that they're given and actually show up, these are the people that you can link together. And there is, as I mentioned earlier, the analytical firepower is available to do just that. Email addresses, P.O. boxes, phone numbers, physical addresses. All of that, believe it or not, they still share some of these data points. That's when I'm talking about the who. Once you've detected the activity, the what, then we need to spend a little bit more time gathering up the data and looking at the who aspects of it. Anchor data, we called it at Bank of America, we ran a pilot project, and we did finally consolidate credit card, mortgage, checking accounts, wealth management. We started to notice that we had what we called anchor data, and that was we had a history of some type of activity taking place. They were either on a watch list, or we had closed an account, or there was known fraud somewhere in that network. We used that anchor data, and we came up with about 40 fraud rings almost instantaneously when we ran the project. Public source information, and this was the Bank of America pilot. What you see there, the red is what we detected just through our normal processes. The blue represents fraud that we couldn't see without making the links and running the analytics across the data and consolidating the data. So we were blind to most of the fraud that was taking place. This is a multi-million dollar fraud ring. The hubs there that you see are common bank accounts. So eventually a lot of this fraud money sweeps into a master account, and then it goes out somewhere. If you're looking at a medical clinic, a front, for example, what you'll see is money will go into this account, this bank account, but it'll move through pretty quickly. It won't stay there for operating expenses and normal business expenses. The money will move out quickly, and it'll fall into one of these collection accounts, and then it'll get out of the country or wherever they want it to go. But this was an extremely dramatic example of what I call the networked fraud activities. 40 of these rings surfaced in a 2-week pilot, multi-million-dollar rings. So, there is a lot of data. I can make this presentation available to you. I won't go through all of this because we're almost out of time. We probably are out of time. But there's a lot of public information available, public source information available, death master list, wage and hour information, all kinds of data out there, corporations, Secretary of State data that can be added into your existing holdings of data to enrich that data and give you a better understanding of what you're dealing with. This is an example of some matching projects that took place within Social Security. They are encumbered by what people call the Computer Matching Act, which makes it very difficult to consolidate databases. That has been broken down with respect to CMS and the healthcare field. But I think we overestimate that obstacle. I think the bigger obstacle is a human one. It's a human factor, and I experienced this at Bank of America, is people want to hang on to their data. It's part of their, if you're a supervisor in some sort of managerial role, you take away my data, you take away my power base. If I have to consolidate, that means somebody might have to go. There's a human nature pushback that takes place when you start to get to the point of actually consolidating data and becoming more efficient at what you do. I don't think it's nearly the privacy issues, the technology issues. I don't think they're nearly as formidable as the human factor here. So I've talked about most of this stuff. Most of our case management systems are nothing more than case inventory systems or case warehouse systems. We can pull up a case in an Access database, but we can't manage workflow, and we certainly aren't running, this case management platform on top of common data warehouse, if you will. And I would submit as a final theme that government agencies are in a better position actually than the financial institutions and the insurance companies to make this work. That may be a simplistic statement, but when you're dealing in the financial sector, you're at a competitive level. And so there's a huge barrier there, for example, financial institutions to consolidating between financial institutions, even insurance companies. But government agencies shouldn't have that competition. So I think you're in a very good position to actually break down some of these silos and actually go hunting for the bad guys. Because right now they're in a risk-free environment. Nobody's hunting them down. They're sort of the apex predators. They're out there operating in a very comfortable zone. The risk is low, the benefits are extremely high. And I think we can introduce some risk into their environment if we actually go looking for them as opposed to waiting for the fraud to happen, detecting it, and 90 days later chasing it down. So with that, I'll go back and yield back my time, which I've gone over on. Thank you very much.
So as I mentioned earlier, Chris is going to be coming back for Q&A at the conclusion of panel number 1. And our first panelist leading us off, our partner in this endeavor, the Director for the Center for Technology and Government at the University at Albany, Teresa Pardo. Teresa?
Somebody's magically doing this. Great. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. That was really great. And as we talked earlier in preparing, I think sets up the stage perfectly for some of the remarks I'm going to make. So good afternoon, everybody. As Bob says, my name is Teresa Pardo. I'm with the Center for Technology and Government I just got to check my clock, at the University at Albany, and we're happy to co-host this important event. We think that this is a very critical issue that we all have the opportunity to work together on and to work in new ways. My presentation is going to focus on the idea that we need new kinds of capability to do the things that Chris has laid out as so critically important to address these kinds of issues. And so I'll tell you, actually, I put a couple of slides in here. Am I pushing the wrong one? I had it upside down. To tell you a little bit about CTG so you know where I'm coming from with my perspective and my remarks. So the center that I direct is an applied research center at SUNY Albany, the University at Albany, for the new naming convention. Our interest is in working very specifically with government organizations to help them understand how to engage in technology innovation, how to look at information as an asset and use that information and technology to improve public service programs, public service delivery, and to make a difference really in the way the world operates. And we will look very specifically at the intersection of policy, management, and technology. So while we're often technologists, we wear technology hats, we very much more typically wear management and policy hats, looking at how we have to think about technology from a public policy or public management perspective, how the availability of technology can change or influence the way we think about government organizations. So this is the frame of reference that we use in our work, thinking about how technology is changing very rapidly, how public organizations and the way they operate and they interoperate with organizations from the private sector, from civil society, are changing, but not quite as rapidly as we might like them to sometimes with respect to taking advantage of technology innovations, and even more significantly, public policy changing at a much more at a much slower pace. In many cases, we're happy with this, right? That's the way we designed our system to work in this way. But in some cases, it's a little frustrating. And so this balance, this tension between the pace of change among these three things, we think is a really important part of this conversation. I've been using this slide here for 20 years. It still works. There's information everywhere, but the information that we need, as Chris has pointed out, the information that we need to do the job here of detecting and preventing fraud, waste, and abuse is very expensive. It's very hard to get our hands on, and it's very hard to use in very effective ways. I love that slide with the small brain and the big ear. I think that's a big issue right now in government, in particular, creating new workforce capabilities, not only to gather the data, to analyze it, but then to use it in very practical and effective ways. So the Center for Technology and Government over the last 20 years has had a number of projects with the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Justice, and many other organizations looking at information sharing as a phenomena, as a conceptual idea. And through all that work, we've essentially come to one of these, this is one of our conclusions, and I think it goes well to Chris's point, which is that it's relatively easy, if you will, to solve a very specific problem in a very specific organization. But once we try to create capability to share information across an entire system, a set of enterprises, to focus on a systemic issue, it's increasingly difficult to do and very, very likely not to succeed. And so as I think about the kind of detection process, the prevention activities that we're talking about, this picture comes to mind. A specific program or a specific problem solving within a single organization is very, very different from systemic capacity building in order to address the extent of the problem that we see here. Oh, well, that didn't work. There we go. Information, I'm going to go like this because we don't have much time. So information sharing is a really important capability for government organizations, as has been outlined, I think, very nicely by Chris. We have to pay attention to what it takes to do this and to do it well. It's at the foundation of what we're talking about here. And I'm going to give you a couple of quick stories to give you a sense of initiatives that are happening around the U.S., but also things that might help us understand how big the problem is, even when we have some pretty impressive initiatives underway. So this this is a picture of the usaspending.gov website. The focus of usaspending.gov was to allow people to see what was happening with our data, with our funds, right? The prime award spending data. What's happening around the U.S.? How is that money being spent? How is it being spent across time, across jurisdiction? And so people look at these images and they go, this is amazing, this is wonderful, tells me everything I need to know in order to understand the trends, in order to launch a request that more money gets spent in my district, all of these kinds of wonderful things that are possible. This site even tells me where the data is coming from. Right? It tells me how the databases across the federal government are being integrated and help me get a fuller picture. What it doesn't tell me is that although there are all kinds of interesting features and functionality, there's some serious problems with the data itself. Right? So there's all these value-enabling characteristics. I can download data, I can do visualizations, et cetera. I'm not going to spend much time on that. But where the value gets limited is in that data itself. Huge inaccuracies in the data, huge concerns about what the data does and doesn't tell us. And so while we pay attention to creating systems that support the integration of data, we also need to pay attention to the problems with the data itself. Not just bringing it together, but understanding where did it come from? How is it created? What are the issues at the basic level of the data quality, and how can we address those issues? How far upstream do we need to go to make sure that the data that we're using in new and complex analytical models actually represents the closest truth as possible. It's expensive, going back to our first diagram. It's very expensive to fix these kind of data problems, and you can see here that Vivek Kundra, the CIO of the US federal government, said, sorry, we've got usaspending.gov, but we don't have any money to fix the problem, so use it as much as you can. Hopefully you can use it to detect some fraud, some abuse, some waste in the deployment of funds. So very expensive. Another area that we need to spend some time thinking about in terms of these larger data integration, information sharing capability issues, I'm going to watch my clock, is in financial market stability. Huge challenges associated with bringing together information across the regulatory agencies, across the financial services industry, across the watchdog agencies, so we can understand what's happening in that system and reduce the likelihood that we will introduce instability into the markets. Again, going up, and the conversation right now globally is how can we do real-time detection of malfeasance, if you will, in the markets. How can we create the capability for that real-time detection and intervention to occur? Mary Shapiro, the Basel Committee, the IMF, everybody gets that information sharing and integration is at the heart of what we need to pay attention to. Challenges to cross-boundary information sharing. I think Chris has talked a lot about these, so I won't say too much more. We've got some mechanisms in place to share information across the financial services and regulatory agencies, but it's really not enough. We've got human intervention issues looking at how what are the incentives to disclose? We've talked about public sector data, private sector data. What are the incentives to disclose that data? Where are the conflict of interest issues, and what is the impact of those issues on the systems and our ability to create system-wide sharing capability? So again, what we know, we've got all kinds of legacy systems out there. We've got privacy issues to deal with. We have conflicting interests of regulators in the financial services. I think Chris mentioned this. And one day, we're able to detect undesirable behavior. The next day, they come up with a new algorithm. It takes the government 3 weeks to catch up with that new algorithm to detect the underlying issues associated with that algorithm, and then, et cetera. It's a leapfrogging process, and we need new capability within the government arena to understand how to detect such behavior. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time. This was a DA that we worked with as we were helping the U.S. Department of Justice develop a new information sharing capability assessment model. Her comment, exactly this: criminals are protected by chaos. I think Chris has made that point sufficiently well. So what's happening around the world to kind of address some of these things? This is just a website capture of an organization that is called Orgpedia. .org, and what they are doing is trying to create a global legal entity identifier so that any individual organization can be linked through this system with any other entity with which it is legally connected. One of the problems with the financial market issues in 2007 is that we weren't able to fully appreciate how extensive the issues are, if one person was identified as engaging in difficult or undesirable behavior, how could we track that behavior across the system and take action? This is a huge global challenge. It's expected to take years. It's understood to be at the heart of our ability to detect potentially in real time and to organize data around necessary interventions. Everybody here, I'm sure, has heard about big data and the new oil. Right? So big data is everywhere. Can't have a conversation about almost anything in government anymore without thinking about or hearing about big data. One of my concerns about that as an information scientist is that there's an awful lot of hype around this phrase, big data. Not really sure what it means to any individual person when they actually use the phrase and what the implications of their use might be. So big data has tremendous potential here, but I would argue that we still have to pay attention to the complexity of using data, whether it's big, small, or otherwise. And I think in particular, government leaders need to pay attention to this complexity, the context that is surrounding our use of information and the sharing of information to detect and prevent fraud and abuse. And I think we really need to take a minute to look at these two images. This is really hard to do at the systemic level, but it's really necessary to do, as Chris has said. We need to pay attention to the complexity of the environment, how all of these layers of the environment interact with each other, and how they help us define and understand context. Again, Chris said we need to understand the context within which particular actions are taking place, within which particular efforts to share information are taking place, and we need to be able to look to the leaders of our organizations to do some very specific things, to create the kind of cross-boundary governance that makes it possible for one agency to compel another, if you will, to share information. We need to invest in workforce capabilities. We need more people able to hear what the data is telling us. Enterprise-oriented resource allocation models, big problem in creating cross-boundary information sharing capability. And I'll just quickly, where I'm sure I'm out of time, but we see a lot in government legislation, the reaction to crisis capacity building. Here's a crisis, let's create new capacity to solve this problem, this particular crisis, but not a broad look at the more systemic kinds of issues that are facing society and that really we need to use information and technology innovation to address. So thank you very much for hearing my part of this conversation. I look forward to talking to you more about these issues.
Here from SAS is their principal in the Fraud and Financial Crimes Global Practice, Sean Berry.
Great, thanks, Bob. As a former state government official, I have sat in meetings like this before, and sometimes I have come out of them saying, man, I must stink at the job that I do. It's easy sometimes to see the big problem. Chris has very much and very well pointed out that there is a problem, and Teresa did a good job talking about the data challenges that are involved. What I'd like to do is to spend just a few minutes to talk to you about what are ways that we might be able to approach this as state government officials. How can we make a difference? I'll start by talking about the concept of fraud fatigue. Undoubtedly, the people in this room have been in meetings like this before. They've heard about how terrible the fraud problem is, program integrity. Everybody's ripping off the state or the county. They're taking money when they shouldn't be. And you hear that message over and over and over again, and after a while, you become a little immune to it. You don't hear it with the same ears as you once may have. A lot of government officials will simply say, you know, we're doing a pretty good job now. Just this morning, I went out to the internet and I just did a couple of quick Google searches. And you can see some of the headlines here. Very fascinating, the very top one, the top left. A Chicago lawyer was convicted here in New York in a tax fraud case. And if you look at the details there, his role in a 10-year tax fraud that generated $7 billion in phony tax losses, a scheme authorities have called the largest tax fraud in history. Dateline, November 1st, 2013. You see other things. I put up the Long Island Railroad logo. I live out in Rockville Center in Nassau County, and if anybody of you or any of you are familiar with the Long Island Railroad and the recent scandal there where I think 85% of the employees retired on disability, there was a massive fraud scheme there. Food stamp, Medicaid fraud, postal employees charged with unemployment insurance fraud. My point is, even though some of you may have this concept of fraud fatigue, and despite the best efforts that you and that your staff are making today, we're not keeping pace. As Chris very well described, the landscape has changed. We need to adapt with it. So how can we do that adaptation? What I would suggest as a way to think about a way to change the way we do business and to get better at our jobs is to take what might be called an enterprise approach towards fraud detection and fraud prevention. Now, what does that mean? Both Chris and Teresa talked very deeply and eloquently about silos. You guys are very well aware of those, whether those silos are agencies, whether they are data silos. They clearly exist in state government. As you can see from the blue silos on this diagram, you may have workers' compensation data, unemployment insurance, Medicaid, SNAP, TANF, and so forth. Data in state government programs that there's generally not systemic communication on and sharing of. Oftentimes you'll have one-off sharing of data between and among these different program areas or these agencies, but it generally doesn't happen on a systemic basis. At the same time, each agency, and sometimes even within an agency in different program areas, you may have different fraud detection systems that you use, different pieces of software that you use to go after the bad guys and detect and find them. And clearly, each agency and program area tends to have its own investigative unit that has its own mission and its own program area. What I would suggest that we're starting to see emerge as a trend in other states is to break down these barriers. The first way to break down those barriers is to look at data sharing. Sharing data across agencies, sometimes in ways that you may not immediately think as an intuitive way would be a wise thing to do. An easy example might be to look at unemployment insurance data and compare it to corrections data. Are there people who are in jails in this state who are receiving unemployment insurance? A relatively simple data match. You might also look, though, in some program areas where you are trying to question whether or not the person, the citizen, is giving you correct information about an address, for example. Where can you go to find good address information? You can clearly go buy it from an external source. But in a state like Texas and Oklahoma, some experience that I've had shows you that if you go to the agency that issues hunting and fishing licenses, people who ask for hunting and fishing licenses want those licenses. They have a pretty strong incentive to give you the right data, the correct information about where they live. So something like hunting and fishing licenses can be used by other program areas to validate and to obtain good data and good information. I'm sure that for those of you who do this on a daily basis, you know that there are data sources that you would like to get from some other state government programs that would help you out tremendously. What I also suggest is not just that consolidated view of data, bringing together data, it's also then looking at it from the systemic side, using the same technology framework to be able to go out and to do advanced detection, very sophisticated detection, often in a prepayment environment, stopping a transaction before it happens or before it gets paid out the door. Now, this enterprise approach does not necessarily mean at that top level that you have to create one massive investigation unit in the state. It's a public policy choice. As leaders, you can choose to continue to maintain individual investigative areas, program integrity areas, inspector general units, or you can combine them. But at least this approach gives you the flexibility to take that idea. For example, in Virginia, Virginia is moving towards more of a consolidated view at the top through a single statewide inspector general that has oversight powers over many of the program integrity units in the various agencies in state government. So there are states out there that are moving towards this model or in variations of this model. Michigan is an example. Believe it or not, Kentucky. We don't necessarily think of Kentucky as being a leader in almost anything in state government and administration, but they are actually moving pretty well and pretty quickly here. Louisiana, North Carolina, Washington. There tend to be states that are moving in this direction and making significant impacts in program integrity. Now, another thing that I'd like to talk about, just as a concept and a takeaway for you to go back to your offices to consider, is to look at the types of analytics. Not going back to and bringing you back too much to your statistics class when you were in college, but I'll talk a little bit about the analytical methods. What I would suggest is that because of the complexity of the types of schemes that Chris talked about, you need a bevy of arrows that you can use to shoot at this problem, if you will. So different types of analytics can be used to detect different types of situations. Two examples are things that almost every state government agency does today. They'll do some type of business rules. So a very easy example might come from the Department of Tax and Finance here in New York. If you ask for an income tax refund of $5,000 or more, that's a red flag. We're going to stop you. We're going to take a little extra look at that refund request. Some very simple logic like that. Or a database search like I just described, matching unemployment insurance data against corrections data. But that's not enough. That doesn't get you to find the really difficult types of complex fraud schemes that Chris talked about. So what I would suggest that there's some other areas that you need to look at. The first would be anomaly detection on the upper left of this diagram. The best way to describe this, I think most of you may understand it, but I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they love to watch Sesame Street. And in Sesame Street, there's a little skit or routine that they do, which is which one of these is not like the other. And they'll have 4 plates of cookies, and 3 of the plates will have 1 cookie, and the other plate has 3 cookies. Pretty simple. Which one of these is not like the other? That's what anomaly detection is. Anomaly detection is looking at your data, looking at behaviors in your data, and seeing who is behaving differently than others in a strange way or an unusual way. It seems like a pretty simple concept, and it actually is, but to use it to find fraud and program integrity is a pretty powerful tool. The same is also true in the bottom left of predictive models. Predictive models are the techniques that most of our credit card companies have used to lower fraud rates to under 1% in the credit card industry. And I think for any of our industries or state government program areas, if we had less than a 1% fraud rate, we would be ecstatic. So predictive models are essentially just looking at past behaviors to see what the common characteristics are of known bad guys in the past, and then looking forward as new transactions come through, how much do you look like the known bad guy? How similar are you to that known bad guy? Finally, 2 other areas that I think are really sort of pushing the bounds of fraud, but this is where you're going to get some very significant benefit. The bottom right is social network analysis. Now, that's not Twitter or Facebook. What social networks are going out and looking at who knows whom, who is related to whom, using your data to draw pictures, much like what a good cop would do if they were out doing an investigation. This is using data analytics to automatically draw and to make those connections that may not be immediately evident to the human eye. Finally, text mining is going out into text documents like Microsoft Word documents and trying to mine information and data out of those documents. So for example, in Medicaid, you might be able to take an electronic medical record and see the notes that a doctor has put in his or her record and compare that to the claim that has come in to see is what is being billed for consistent with the notes that the doctor provided. So these types of analytics are things that you should strongly consider as you go back to your jobs and to your agencies and think about how to take the lessons of today forward. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Bob. We've got another panelist, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of the panel.
Wrapping up panel one and helping us to create a bridge to our consideration of fraud, waste, and abuse in New York State from the Office of the State Comptroller is Pete Granis. Pete?
What a depressing subject. And to start off with Chris, I mean, to have the director of the FBI, assistant director of the FBI, being caught in credit card fraud, it just shows the nature of what we're dealing with. So, Chris, what was that credit card number?
They already have it.
Clearly, there's a lot going on, and some of the work that we do in the Comptroller's Office is directly related to sort of the micro vision of what's happening out in the fraud detection world. So I just want to go quickly through some of the work that we do with this big office of ours and to describe some of the analytical work and investigatory work and programmatic analysis that we do on a daily basis to look after the interests of the taxpayers of New York. Clearly, the Comptroller's job is to ensure that the taxpayers' money is used effectively and efficiently to promote the common good. That's a mission that comes from the Constitution, state constitution, and also from the statute law. Our office audits state agencies and local governments, as well as school districts, charter schools, local development corporations, public authorities. We maintain the state's accounting system. We administer the state's payroll and retirement system. We review contracts and payments and provide financial management, oversight, and assistance to local governments. We have a staff of 2,600 professional auditors statewide that make integrity and independence the hallmark of our office. Now, to get to the big picture, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners estimates that as much as 5% of the revenue of any great big institution may be related to fraud. For us, with a $150 billion budget, that actually reaches a fairly staggering number. And while the number may be high, whatever it is, we're very mindful in our office that every dollar lost to fraud, waste, and abuse is a dollar that could have gone to things that taxpayers care about and are expecting to get from their government. As the state's chief auditor, the Comptroller's Office, under Comptroller DiNapoli, is responsible for preventing fraud, waste, and abuse. And I just want to go quickly on how we do it. Obviously, through constant vigilance. Fraud is not static, as Chris and Teresa have been talking about. It's changing all the time. And with the lightning speed of changes in technology today, it has never been more challenging to try to stay on top of it. At OSC, we meet the challenge through audits, investigations, training, and coordinated outreach. As again, we employ more than 600 professional auditors who collectively have identified nearly $1 billion in taxpayer savings over the past years, of which $60 million was directly related to fraud. Our investigations unit, comprised of former prosecutors, experienced criminal investigators, directs our fraud examinations. We've developed a special program called Don't Get Burned. I think there are flyers about that here, which provides outreach training, assistance, and data to government agencies and not-for-profits to help them in their jobs. Since January of 2011, our auditors have participated in nearly 1,700 training sessions with government and not-for-profit leaders and their key staff on forensic audit techniques and new technology to detect fraud and avoid abuse. Having partners inside and outside of government who are well-informed about fraud is nearly as critical to our mission as having strong internal controls. When OSC auditors access a high probability of fraud while planning or conducting an audit, they work with our investigators who are trained in evidence transfer and criminal referral protocols. This helps to ensure that the audit captures and the quality and extent of evidence that is needed for effective prosecution. Our auditors also use sophisticated software and data analysis techniques to produce strong audit findings. Toward that end, the Comptroller has built collaborative partnerships with federal, state, and local law enforcement officials, including the county and borough district attorneys. One of our most successful collaborations has been through the Comptroller's Joint Task Force on Public Integrity with the Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. Among its many benefits, the partnership provides the Attorney General with powers to criminally prosecute corruption involving taxpayer money, significantly expanding the AG's authority to pursue public integrity cases. Through these partnerships, we've identified and brought to justice many people who have violated the public trust, and with thefts ranging from millions of dollars down to just a few $1,000s. In one of our most current high-profile cases, our investigations unit assisted the Attorney General in providing evidence supporting the charges against a man named Willie Rapfogel, who was the executive director of one of our great social service agencies, who had been carrying on, allegedly, activities where he'd been laundering money, taking money that wasn't appropriately his for many, many years. And just this past month, our work was instrumental in the arrests of supervisors of two local towns, Niagara and Half Moon, in separate cases. In one, the town supervisor engaged in an ongoing scheme to steal town property and use town employees' equipment for his own use. In Half Moon, a case that's gotten some notoriety around here, the supervisor stole nearly $6,000 in campaign contributions from her campaign finance account. But to us in the OSC, the amount of theft is not necessarily the critical issue. For us, it always goes back to the violation of the faith that the public has entrusted to those who either are working for government or receiving government funding. On the state's largest expenditure, OSC has been a leader in safeguarding the state's $52 billion Medicaid program, which serves 5 million New Yorkers. Our Medicaid claims unit is run by a team of 35 auditors using advanced software tools to ensure the accountability in their continuous audits of program provider payments. Since January of 2011, we've completed 43 Medicaid audits that identified nearly $300 million in cost recoveries and an equal amount in questionable transactions. $600 million has been saved to the taxpayers. We've, in this process, have found outrageous instances of fraud. Working collaboratively with our investigators, we've shut down a multi-million-dollar Medicaid dental fraud in the borough of Brooklyn called Dental Hawkers, in which a family of dentists, father, grandfather, and son, hustled homeless people with payments to come into their offices so that they could then use their Medicaid claim numbers to file claims worth millions and millions of dollars. For that, we got restitution and a criminal jail sentence for one of the ringleaders of that operation. As in our other fraud-fighting efforts, we partner with agencies that play significant roles in ensuring the integrity of the state Medicaid program, including the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General, the OMIG, as well as the AG's Medical Fraud Control Unit, and local district attorneys who prosecute Medicaid fraud cases. We coordinate our efforts with these agencies to ensure both the most effective deployment of government resources and audit coverage. I just want to highlight the Comptroller's ongoing efforts to root out fraud and increase accountability in the state's $1.5 billion special education program. A 2012 audit initiative which we started to improve accountability among the 400 private, for-profit, and not-for-profit providers of special ed services exposed the effects of years of weak oversight by the state education department. To date, our audits have identified more than $20 million in wasteful and inappropriate payments and resulted in SED increasing its scrutiny of providers. In the process, we found no-show jobs. Executive director of one no-show agency lived in North Carolina and yet billed for $170,000 for work done in New York, where a state she barely visited. Nepotism was another, billing for personal expenses, tuition for their kids, landscaping services. It goes on and on. It's pretty shocking when you look at the list. Obviously, our audits have generated media interest. The legislature this last session passed a bill to require us to do a series of audits of all of the 400 providers. We're waiting for the governor to make a decision on that, which is a bill that's been, in the queue for him to take up and review it in the next few months. It also directs the Education Department to look more carefully at their reimbursement methodology to find out if there's a better way to pay providers that reduce the incidence of fraud. Our contract oversight responsibilities, again, provide us with yet another way to detect fraud and waste. As the state's chief financial officer, the controller, in both his constitutional and statutory roles, reviews contracts before they are effective and it audits all payments. We also conduct extensive post-audit reviews of contracts and payments to ensure the taxpayers' money is spent for its intended purposes. Obviously, this is part of a continuous control throughout the planning for use of state monies. During the last fiscal year, we reviewed 23,700 contracts valued at nearly $50 billion to ensure that, among other things, the vendor selection was fair and the costs were reasonable. At the same time, our payment audits prevented or recovered over $34 million in fraudulent waste or improper payments. Often the types of fraud and abuse that we find in these audits are infuriating to the public, and rightfully so, and I must say that they give some satisfaction to those of us that work on these issues in protecting the hard-earned money of taxpayers. For example, our office implemented edit checks involving the Department of Tax and Finance's electronic database of refunds. And in 2013, I think Teresa and Chris mentioned this, stopped over $50 million in improper funds before they were paid. We use electronic file matching to identify, we've been using electronic file matching to identify inappropriate unemployment insurance benefits to inmates housed at the Department of Corrections. Based on the success of this match, the department expanded it not just to the state-run correctional institutions, but to the county-run jails. Through this match, again, we've identified inappropriate payments of hundreds of thousands of dollars to people that have been in jail that should not be getting unemployment insurance, obviously. And recently, where privacy issues prevented two agencies from sharing data with one another, our office facilitated an electronic file match to determine where daycare credits claimed on personal income tax returns were appropriate. As a result, we saved taxpayers nearly $6 million in inappropriate payments, which we stopped before they were made. But in addition to reviewing and approval of the audit functions we perform, we rely on strong internal controls and financial processes within agencies and local governments to ensure that funds are spent according to their intended purpose. Consequently, we regularly evaluate the financial controls of agencies and local governments as a test of the continuous control that protects taxpayers. When we find weaknesses, we advise agencies and work with them to strengthen the work they do even before the contracts are developed and expenditures are made. In a somewhat different mode on the local government side, while we issue about 400 audits a year of municipal and local and school districts annually, we also expend significant resources in working with local officials and staff across the state in municipalities large and small. We call it helping hands, and we have a variety of ways to reach out to officials. We actually worked with over 10,000 last year in training sessions. This is work that doesn't get much attention. Again, stopping fraud before it starts is our real goal here, and to the extent that internal controls and professionals that deal with these issues at the local government level have the skills and the tools at the ready, they can do that work before we have to stop payments or worry about things after the fact. Obviously, stopping fraud before it starts is a clear priority. In closing, I just want to talk very briefly. I know my friend Senator Golden is here about the bill he and Assemblyman Hevesy have proposed, which is, I think, pending. I just want to suggest that while their goal is laudatory, it makes little sense to set up a shadow office to basically replicate the staff resources and the work that OSC already does and is constitutionally required to do regarding all state-funded programs and what the OMIG is responsible for in relation to Medicaid. I just respectfully, and I do this because I know Senator Golden very well, that it would be far better to provide us or OMIG with our existing audit, IT, investigative capabilities, and years of experience with the additional resources if more work is needed in this, rather than setting up a new agency, costly new agency, just to replicate the work that we do already, Senator. So you and I can talk about that at some point. We obviously look forward to working with the legislature and with the executive on ways to combat fraud. It's a big issue. It's one that captures the public's attention. Every one of our press releases, when we release our audits, is written up. It's a very difficult field. It's evolving, as Teresa said, very quickly. We need to find ways to use our resources to best advantage. So I think this is an interesting forum for us to hear this discussion going on of what's out there. I just want to caution one more thing. We've had laws on the books for against robbing banks forever. And as long as there's money to be made, I'm sorry to say, I think the crooks are going to keep one step ahead of us, because no matter how good our analytical capabilities are, these thousands of people that are looking to take money that's not theirs will always seem to be a little bit ahead of us. So to the extent we can catch up and close that gap and keep abreast of them with the existing capabilities we have, or those that may exist today and be developed over time, obviously we have a lot of work to do. But the taxpayers expect us to do this job, and we will continue to do it the best way we can. Thank you.
So then you should go to your seat. And Chris, if we could get you to come up, and Teresa and Sean. So we do have microphones that we're going to station in the room, and we're going to encourage you to use this as an active opportunity to question our speakers. One thing I will say, though, too, is I'm going to keep this down to about 10 minutes. We know that we have to be careful stewards of your day, and so to the extent that there's a question that you wish to ask that doesn't get covered, please do feel free to speak to our presenters after the conclusion of the program. I know that they would be pleased to answer your questions. So please raise your hands if you have any questions. And while we wait, why don't I go ahead and launch in with the first. I think about the hunter and the prey example, Chris. And, I think that was a good example. Back when drug abuse was at its peak, we talked about demand reduction as opposed to supply reduction. And it seems to me that we're dealing with an ethos here that potentially that we're not going to be able to clamp down on the crime until we can get the potential perpetrator to examine their own motivations. And so what can we do? And I pose that to the panel to reduce this whole notion of perpetration.
Well, since you brought up a concept that I talked about, we've created an environment where it's relatively easy, and we haven't created it. I mean, the system exists to take care of the beneficiaries, the people that need these benefits. If it's a financial institution, it's customer service and products and services. We've created a situation, however, where it's way too easy to commit fraud. And there is a deterrent factor there that I think is very important. We don't see enough of these people brought to justice in a public sort of way, and especially when it comes to the broader organizational activity. I just would like to, I would like to see more attention and more prioritization afforded to that broader activity. I think the opportunists can be deterred by seeing that, I hate to call it a public flogging, but the opportunists are deterred because they see the enforcement activity taking place. The professionals are deterred because you become the hardest target on the block.
Sean, how about you?
What I would suggest is that as we start to move towards more prepayment detection and analysis, stopping the crime while it is being committed sends a very strong message that, hey, we're watching. We know what you're doing, and we're going to try to stop it. So if it's not perceived as being as easy as it is, as Chris has mentioned, and there's this viewpoint that, wow, they are watching, that's going to have a very big impact on that ethos.
Chris used the phrase public flogging, and actually, please, Pete.
Just clearly, we could, if we stopped every payment and spent 2 weeks looking at every single payment, we could obviously detect a lot more fraud and avoid a lot more waste. But, we as a state provide money to people that provide services. And somehow, the idea of, it's an academic thing to say carefully vet every payment, but we make hundreds of thousands of payments every single day, and if those were delayed for the assurance, the absolute assurance, you'd have, and I was in the legislature for a long time, you would have an awful lot of providers down our necks so quickly when they didn't get paid for the services they provide and the bills that they have to pay, that, there has to be a balance. So obviously, doing the careful analysis and doing, the kinds of analytics you talked about, Sean, pulling together profiles and things where we could quickly make decisions is one thing, but, holding up payments, for any appreciable time, and we are already under the gun right now for holding up payments to some providers for early intervention services. People are furious about not getting the money on time, and it's just a process that in government you have to balance the risks associated with the benefits of, being able to pay the people that provide the services.
That's a great point, Pete. And I think that's where we can learn from, say, the credit card industry that has done a great job of doing this detection upfront and trying to stop payments, but having a very strong economic incentive to not upset the vast majority of people who are good transactors in credit cards. So there is a balance that you have to strike. And I think that technology and analytics have made that a much easier balance to strike going forward.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for having a really good sense of appropriate intervention strategies. So, for example, in the financial market regulatory community, one strategy is once anomalous behavior is detected, they use various models to determine if this is intentional behavior or is it a lack of full appreciation or understanding of the regulatory framework. So they begin to understand which kind of activity requires sort of criminal investigation, which kind of activity is more appropriately handled with sort of a new focus on workforce development. This actually, what you're doing is actually not appropriate behavior, which kind of activity requires or benefits from individual intervention. And so understanding sort of landscape and then launching appropriate strategies, I think, is something that's quite appropriate. What are the top end violators, the mid-range, and the sort of the accidental criminals, right? What are they doing? How can we change behavior? I think depends on what's happening at the individual levels.
Okay, questions now from the room. Please, sir.
I have 2-3 questions that are related. You mentioned the term fraud fatigue. Is there fatigue on the part of the tax enforcement people or on the part of participants?
I think the fraud fatigue is something that we see among state government officials who have heard the message over and over again of, oh, fraud is bad, it continues to be bad, and they say, I'm doing a pretty good job and I'm doing all my best efforts. So it's mostly among those folks. I haven't seen it in the public as much yet.
Okay. The people who engage in these activities, these are illegal economic activities. They compare this with the legal economic activities. They go through the same kind of cost analysis, how profitable it is, and when they get caught, they pay fine, they go to jail, that the cost of doing illegal business. So the whole idea of the government is to, as much as possible, is to make the illegal economic activity as unprofitable as much possible, because they'll keep a step ahead of you. I mean, these people are, they're educated like you and I. As the press is, they also have a lot of tax accountants, a lot of other people who tell them what to do. The third point is, which was brought to my part of this is, are there any tax or the enforcement officials who become informal to them? Look, you do this, we are making this law, you do this. Are there any studies of those people who, from your enforcement people, collude with them?
Okay. Thank you, sir.
I've seen anecdotal evidence of that. I've only seen anecdotal evidence of essentially being corruption.
We need to give up.
Just one very quick question. Somebody told me the other day, I was reading a book on this. Why are we going through this process? It is because we have lost God in our life. The fear of God, the moral values, the family values were always a kind of indirect deterrent so that we can behave properly. Our education, teaching the professional ethics, maintaining proper accounts. To some extent, I think we should bring those values back if possible.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question before we go to our second panel. Okay, right here, please. Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation this afternoon. My name is Deirdre Brody. I work with KPMG. I was actually a recent Rockefeller grad. And we are involved in a multitude of states who are implementing integrated eligibility systems across their human services programs. And there's a sort of internal debate going on that I'd be really interested in hearing your opinion on as to whether these consolidated systems that help beneficiaries who need these programs the most interact with much more efficient systems that require, that are put far less of the administrative burden on the applicant, but much more on the IT systems of the governments who are issuing these benefits. The idea, though, is that this could, in fact, increase the risk for fraud if you are inputting one set of data one time that is fraudulent, and you're reducing the number of databases or other information sources that you can validate your demographic information, your income information, et cetera, against. So I'd be curious to hear what the panel thinks about sort of increased efficiencies potentially either mitigating risk or enhancing the probability of risk.
Well, one thing that I've picked up on is that when you're very siloed, the vendors who have solutions will sell into your silos, which exacerbates the problem. So I'm a big proponent of consolidated systems, of consolidating data, consolidating something along the lines of what Sean outlined there, at least a common platform that sits on top of the same data. Because I saw it at Bank of America when I was there, I saw it in the government. We're so siloed that vendors just consistently sell into those silos, and you get 10 different solutions and hundreds of databases, hundreds of web-hosted databases, in-house databases, et cetera. So the short answer to me is it cuts both ways, and I think it cuts more to the benefit of detecting fraud and preventing fraud when you consolidate. I hope that makes sense.
So I think there's the challenge of selling to the silo. There's also the challenge of selling the silver bullet. I think historically consolidated human services systems have been fraught with issues. As long as I've been working in the government technology space, we've been trying to put those systems, and I use we and sort of the royal we, everybody. But I think that's a real problem, and it's a really important problem to solve. And I think one of the things that's most important in kind of addressing the potential weakness in those systems is not relying on the technology to solve the problem. So we've talked at CTG and we've talked today about the need to be paying attention to the policy arena within which those systems are being created, understand the workflow issues, understand the various vulnerabilities, understanding what it takes to actually pull those systems together in a way that reflects deep understanding of the various human services programs that are being brought together. I'll just give one very small example of one of the challenges that we faced when working with a government agency to help think this through. And that's simply the definition of a household. What's a family, right? Depending on the human services agency you're working with, a family is defined differently. And so a big part of the gap in the system in terms of tracking people through the system is a thing like this, the definition of a family. 16 different ways to identify gender. Right? These are huge differences. I don't have any opinion about these various differences, but they have to be attended to. We have to recognize that technology is not the answer to resolving all of these differences.
There's a huge benefit, though, in the consolidated enrollment process, where somebody comes in looking for government services and provides one set of information that avoids multiple inputs from different agencies, and that is run against, against databases. And something is spun out saying, here's what you're eligible for, and here's how the check is, here's what you're going to get. And I think that the risks associated with the current system, where everybody puts in their own data, and there's always mistakes, there are human errors, there are different, you show up 3 different days and you just remember things differently, as opposed to providing all the information, having it run against a consolidated set of databases, and then the beneficiary is told, here are your eligibility criteria, here's what you get. and here's what we're going to be able to help you with. And I think there's real value to that. I think that far outweighs the risks of, somebody gaming the system with a phony income level or a phony address, or, I think that provides a much more reliable and fair and better system to run our social service programs.
Sean, final comment?
I concur with Pete. If you're in an integrated eligibility system and you lie about your income and you say you make 15 grand and you really make 45 grand, you have a bigger chance of screwing up. The risk is greater on that individual transaction. But I think to Pete's point, there are risks in having the separate databases. And as long as you're doing the check, which each of those individual unintegrated eligibility systems should have been doing, then you mitigate that risk. So the overall net is that it's better to do the integrated eligibility and to do the fraud detection at that point. And of course, in integrated eligibility, you're just trying to get the opposite side of the coin of fraud detection, which is making it easier for the citizens and for those people who truly do need it. And that's, I think that outweighs any of the concerns that we have.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Chris and our panelists. So to kick off panel 2, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Senate sponsor of the Enterprise Fraud Program Bill, Senator Marty Golden. Senator Golden.
Thank you, Bob. That is an excellent panel, and hopefully we can come together with some good best practices and move forward to create something here in this great state that will really work for this great state. I'd like to start by thanking you for this opportunity. I'd like to especially thank SUNY Albany and, of course, Rockefeller Institute for putting this event on. This is an important topic that needs to be addressed, and events like these are vital for success. Each day you can open any newspaper in America and find a story detailing fraud, waste, and abuse of a government program. The numbers, I don't got to tell you, they are staggering. And, I heard God mentioned earlier, and God helps them who helps themselves. And it's about time that this state start to help itself and get back the billions of dollars that we lose annually. And we're going to do that. And Peter, I am looking to work with OMEG and all of the different agencies where we can recapture that money and bring that money back into the system. You've seen my hearings. You know I've been out there fighting. I am not happy with the definition of what the OMEG's responsibility is, and I'm not happy with the return of $495 million last year, of which 250 or 240 something was ours and 240 was the federal government. Far too little. You want to talk about a guy? I'm a former New York City police officer, and I represent a place called Brooklyn, New York. Now, for those of you that don't know, Brooklyn, New York is the fraud capital of the nation, okay? Of the nation. I got Brighton Beach, gangs you wouldn't believe. We got rid of the Italian mob, but I wouldn't say we got rid of them. I'd say they're out there, but they're not as big as they are or were. But we have Brighton Beach. We got Spanish. We got Chinese. We got Palestinians. You name it, I got it. We want to talk about fraud? Unemployment insurance, welfare fraud, Medicaid fraud, Medicare fraud, food stamp fraud, auto fraud. Auto fraud. All we need is one of these companies to say, hey, New York, you're not doing anything. We're out of here. We've had it happen already once. Imagine one of these insurance companies leaving. What's that cost of that insurance rate going to be to that ratepayer across the state? We have cigarette smuggling. I don't know if you've seen that last couple of weeks. We lose over $1 billion in tax revenue in this state on fraud in cigarettes being brought into this state. We get $44 a carton, $44 a carton in taxes. It's all coming up. You've seen it last 3 weeks. Comes in from Virginia, Maryland, comes in by boat. They bring it into the state of New York. They hit a safe house in Maryland, took $1 million in cash out of there, locked these two guys up. They got them in Rikers Island, and there's a murder for hire scheme. They believe they know the person that's doing the informing. They locked them up again 2 weeks ago. 6 of those are Palestinian, live in my community, money being funneled to the mosque, money being funneled through their enterprises. Banking. Something very simple, right? You go into, and I was amazed to find out that they walk into the bank and they actually got this little scanner, and on the scanner, they scan the number and they get your password. But in the bank, they have a little system that sends off an alarm. So you know that that person is doing that in that bank. Why isn't that at all our ATM machines? And why isn't that in our restaurants and in our retail stores so that they know that they're getting scanned? It's simple stuff that can be done here at all levels, not just government level, but in corporate America itself. So I want to go on and just with your opening, when you sent a invitation, the federal income taxes are underpaid by 17%. There's nearly 7% unemployment claims are improper. This abuse is costing the New York taxpayers billions of dollars each year. That's a minimum of $12 billion to be exact. I want you to think about it. If I am the capital, I'm also the capital of the Obama health care plan and the Medicaid redesign for my hospitals. I don't mind being the capital for that or ground zero for that, but being ground zero for fraud when we know where it's coming from and all we have to do is drop a net over the county of Kings and the county of Westchester, where you have some of the highest fraud in the nation, and start to do this data mining, because it's the same gangs, it's the same people, it's the same doctors in the mills that are doing these pill mills and medical centers that are scamming us on a daily basis out of Medicaid and Medicare dollars. We simply cannot stand for it. As we continue to fight back from the recession, our state economy cannot afford these kinds of losses. And according to the state controller, 2013 debt study, New York's debts outstanding total, $63 billion. We have a second highest debt in the nation, a level 80% higher than New Jersey, and that's the number 3 state. The level of debt combined with widespread fraud, $12 billion is the beginning state. It's much more than that. $12 billion is where we're starting. A huge obstacle for economic development and a burden to the taxpayers that they shouldn't have to bear. Higher debt often results in, of course, what we're going to look to do here in this state is higher taxes and cut government programs. And Peter doesn't want to hear that. And the impact of fraud and waste goes way beyond the program itself. When honest businesses and citizens have to bear the cost to those who seek to evade the abuse of the system. Or worse yet, as it was mentioned earlier, when there aren't enough benefits and an individual truly is in need and is denied. We give food to food banks in Brooklyn. I stand outside. I watch the people come to the food banks, Thanksgiving, Christmas. They come in minks, Cadillacs. They show up in the finest jewelry, and they take food that they do not need. So it's up to us to put protocols in place that will stop. That is not criminal. That's just unethical. But we need to put these protocols into effect so that we can bring back those billions of dollars and give the trust back to the taxpayers here in this state. And we'll work with this governor and with the controller and with the attorney general to achieve those goals. But I think this is a very good bill. Imagine dropping that data net just on one county, just one county. You would be amazed to find out what your return would be. An impact of fraud and waste goes way beyond its program. And the cost is just astronomical. Or worse yet, when there aren't enough benefits, like I spoke of, for those poor people that need them. Our taxpayers deserve better from their government, for government to work to be successful in helping people to act as a voice of the people. It has to have the faith of its people. But as fraud and waste become more rampant, that faith begins to deteriorate. Taxpayers deserve a government that will take necessary steps to ensure the hard-earned tax dollars are protected. Taxpayers deserve a government that can pay its bills. That's why today's event is so important, because the solution to both of these problems are intertwined. We can actually minimize deficits by eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse, but to do so, we can't rely on technology and techniques of yesterday, as the perpetrators of fraud increasingly are using sophisticated methods to beat the system. We must implement the state-of-the-art detection programs to keep pace, which we also heard here this morning. Today, fraud schemes are thriving, and segregated and silos are the nature of our current informational system. We have to get into the silos. We have to be able to get that knowledge to be able to go out there to make and effect these arrests. As an individual interacts with different programs and agencies, either at the same time or over a period of time, that information is trapped in those individual silos. An individual, therefore, can move through systems, taking advantage of each, leaving pieces of the puzzle in each one of those silos, but never, ever, ever being caught. It's time, New York, break down those walls between those silos so that the puzzle can be put together and we can put a stop to this fraud, waste, and abuse. To do this, our state must adopt a more holistic approach, one that encompasses all of the relevant programs and agencies. We can't allow what amounts to be a simple lack of communication between government programs to give the free rein that we give to these criminals. I am pleased to say, though, the steps that we are taking will right some of these wrongs, and they are underway with this new legislation. The centralization of IT across the state and commitment to accountability and transparency has positioned us well to adopt the sophisticated and anti-fraud strategies. I'm also proud to have sponsored a bill that my colleague who could not make it up here today, Assemblyman Hevesy, who could not be here, and establishes the enterprise fraud, and we will move to get that bill passed, that program bill passed, hopefully with the help of Peter and the controller. And the bill will create an enterprise fraud office that would observe the operation detecting fraud across the state's agency lines. These offices would be housed in State Inspector General's office. As much as we want to jump in with 2 feet, we need to ensure that the program works before we commit a large-scale effort. This bill directs the Enterprise Fraud Office to create a pilot program to detect fraud, waste, and improper payments in at least 5 state agencies. The pilot program will be a foundation upon which our fraud detection efforts will be built. The technology that the office will use to detect fraud must provide the following capabilities: automatic fraud detection and alerting, continuous monitoring of program transactions and activity with an ability to identify fraud and improper payments both prospectively and retrospectively, ability to detect non-transactional fraud, such as program eligibility issues and identity theft. Use the latest advanced analytical techniques, including predictive modeling, complex pattern analysis, social network analysis, text mining, and geospatial analysis, spatial analysis, which was also discussed this morning. Feedback and learning, self-learning capabilities to adapt to changing schemes and trends. Advanced entity resolution capabilities to create a holistic view of entities across government to access government agencies, programs, and databases, and the ability to extend and adapt to all areas of state government. Taxpayers will not be footing the bill for these efforts. The amounts recovered will pay for this office and the technology used to detect this fraud. Any amounts that are left will go into the general fund. And I can promise you, ladies and gentlemen, if we really get our heads together and get this bill out and get this bill passed and implement this bill, we will see billions in return on investment. Not hundreds of millions, billions. Right now, New York is fighting fraud within its own silos. While we are making some progress, we cannot do better, or we can do better. Programs that are similar to the programs proposed in my bill have seen great success, which we've talked about. The IRS began utilizing these programs to reduce $345 billion tax gap. The state of Louisiana engaged in an enterprise approach, beginning with both the tax and claims of unemployment. A quick start and phased implementation saw early leads, which tackled at least in 100 days, netting $1 million within the next 3 weeks. Los Angeles County realized the total annual gross cost evidence of $6.8 million due to child care fraud. The list goes on and on and on. The results are obvious. These are great. Many other government organizations are investing in these new approaches of fighting fraud, and they are seeing a big return on their investment. It's time for New York State to follow suit by analyzing information across program and agency lines. We can create comprehensive 21st century approaches to fighting fraud, waste, and abuse. And I am confident if this bill is passed, you will see billions of dollars returned to this state. And that's what we need to do. I went into just some of the fraud. As being a New York City police officer, years ago, I've seen the fraud in the County of Kings grow and grow and grow. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here $496 million is all the money that OMEG could have gotten back last year. We have to redefine OMEG. Let them do their mission. But there's no reason we can't do this bill and bring these 5 agencies in and see what those 5 agencies bring back to us. And if it brings back the success that we believe it will, then we have to do it across the board for all the agencies here in the state of New York, and we will see real return on investment. We need your help to do that. Bob, thank you very much.
Here now from the Office of the Attorney General is Paul Mahoney.
Thank you. I'm one of those government servants who have to come and apologize for recovering only about $2 billion during the course of my career. So I'll try to put some perspective from the boots on the ground. Attorney General Eric Schneiderman is very interested in a public dialogue on fraud, waste, and abuse. When he was in the state legislature, he proposed the New York State False Claims Act, which was an analog to the federal False Claims Act. It was passed in 2007, first major cases coming in 2009, and he's used that as a model as the Attorney General in several branches of our office to continue that area. And that's because it's fundamentally a growth area. I'm going to speak from a Medicaid fraud perspective, but I'll also talk about some of the good work of some of my colleagues at the Attorney General's office. And when I talk about Medicaid fraud, I'm talking about provider fraud. During the course of this afternoon, we've talked a bit about ineligible recipients, the famous Oceana complex in Brooklyn, and those are recipients. To me, from my work, a recipient is an exhibit or a witness, because when we come across recipient fraud, eligibility fraud is very important, don't get me wrong, but you know what? If a person goes through $100,000 of Medicaid benefits in a year, they're pretty sick anyhow. And so in that regard, we have to discuss various levels of fraud, and I'm going to take the Medicaid fraud perspective as we're dealing with it. I've been involved in fraud investigation for 23 years or more, and the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit was started in 1975. So they've been doing it for a while. Who are we? This is just one aspect of what the Attorney General's office does. Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, which we call MFUCU, was created in 1975. It's the national model for this sort of combined hybrid prosecutorial and recovery agency. Right now, this is as a couple of weeks ago, 55 attorneys, 96 forensic auditors, 86 police investigators, and 16 electronic investigation staffers, several of whom are here today. If I made this slide 5 or 6 years ago, I probably would not have included the electronic investigation staffers as part of this list, because in 1975 they didn't exist. And the format was a triangle of investigative attorneys, police officer investigators, and forensic auditors. And over the years, we've had to turn it into a box, a square, because that baseline of electronic investigation has become critical. We're separate and distinct from the Department of Health, and under the Department of Health is the Office of Medicaid Inspector General. That's a silo. There's no question there's a silo effect going on there. One of the difficulties is some of these silos are imposed on the agencies from the outside, and I can't make that change. I encourage you folks to think about that. Within the Attorney General's office, we have other key data-driven investigative relationships. The relatively new Taxpayer Protection Bureau was started in 2011 by Attorney General Schneiderman. That enforces the False Claims Act, mostly in the civil context, on everything that isn't Medicaid, and they've been quite busy. What used to be known as the Criminal Prosecutions Bureau was just renamed last month, and I failed to update my slide. It's now called, quite appropriately, the Criminal Enforcement and Financial Crimes Bureau. That's 25 assistant AGs who take in automobile insurance fraud, all the other securities fraud, and all the other crimes that are essentially not Medicaid fraud. They have great partnerships. When I talked to their chiefs earlier this week just to get some updates, they do not have enough praise for the State Controller's Office and the partnerships they've built there and the data flow that they get. Tax and finance is the lead feed to the Taxpayer Protection Bureau on tax matters. But again, you talk about silos. They have a statutorily imposed minimum threshold of essentially $1 million of underreported income. That's not one of the sort of triage silos that many agencies are supposed to carry out, but that's part of the legislation. And so in that regard, they're already having to leave some people on the table, but their partnerships are extremely productive, and you heard from Pete earlier about some of the cases we've done recently. We do have a data warehouse. Two of the guys who run it are here in the office. I don't even understand it, and I've been working with it for 9 years. The critical aspect of it is that it's analyzable. The Medicaid program systems are not inherently analyzable because they capture too much data, or they capture data that human small brain can't handle. So what our folks do is they take a duplicate copy of that and they trim it, because they need to look at paid claims. What's often more important than paid claims are the submitted and denied claims, because that tells you what the guys tried to get through, the bad guys. I only have good guys and bad guys in my world, unfortunately. And there's a lot of bad girls as well, but they work with the bad guys, so it's quicker. Encounter data reported by the managed care organizations. We haven't talked about managed care and Medicaid today. A sea change in how Medicaid is being operated in New York State. We're going to come close to 100% managed care over the next few years, another intermediary with other data points. We have 3 servers with a combined data capacity of 250 terabytes of data. Larry Logan, our chief, tells me I can't comprehend that number. I can't explain it to you either. But basically, if you think about a terabyte being a traditional college library with paper, that's a terabyte of data. And we play at any moment in time with about 35 terabytes of data at any moment. So let me go through some of our challenges. Our approach to big data. The federal government prohibits the Medicaid fraud control units from data mining. You've heard about data mining? I'm not allowed to do it. I can't go from data to investigation. I have to have someone give me an investigative lead before I go to the data. Now, I should say the feds just modified their regs, and they've allowed us to ask for permission, but we're still working on it because the application is several inches thick. Their view, fair enough, is that they fund the Department of Health to do data mining. Why should they fund us? And we say, going back to our 3 servers, because we can do it. We've already invested in it, and we can do it. Now, data mining is not the answer. Here's some of the pitfalls and practicalities. Someone is always the #1 biller of something. That person could be the #1 crook, or they could be the best cardiologist in New York State. Someone's always going to be #1. So looking at #1 is not a solution. Your biggest hospital in your county is going to be your biggest biller in your county. So that's not going to work standing alone. Another reason why data mining is complex is because the systems, all these systems, normalize the data. When you go into the computer printout, you do not see big crossouts in pencil and someone writing in, oops, goofed, change this to the wrong number. It always looks right. It always balances because your claim doesn't go through unless it balances. So what do the crooks do? They balance it. So the data itself is not going to be the answer. Opinion counts, and regulations without reasons. What I mean by this in shorthand is that it's all well and good to have a regulation. It's all well and good to point out that someone violated a regulation. But at the end of the day, at least in my neck of the woods, we have to go into court and prove something either by a preponderance of the evidence or beyond reasonable doubt in criminal cases. And if we don't have a witness who can testify why this regulation exists and why it doesn't and what it does, then we have difficulty proving our case. And that's a big difficulty in the Medicaid program because it was founded 35 years ago. And some of the regulations are based on reason, logic, and common sense, but the people who wrote it, they retired. And it's very difficult sometimes to prove that up. And of course, at the end of the day, proof of intent, because we have to prove that, at least in a criminal context and actually for treble damages on recovery, that someone intended to do that wrong. And at the end of the day, you end up with a situation where someone may be saying, oh, that person was dead at the time? Must have been someone else walking into my office pretending to be that person. Because as everyone knows, you can't do dentistry in a dead person, so it must have been a live person. So working with our partners, as I said, the Department of Health, OMIG, Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement has been a huge partner in our prescription drug initiative. That's cost New York State a large amount of money over the past few years. And we're working on that. Some of these remedies will not be popular. Everyone is 100% against fraud, waste, and abuse until they're the target of the investigation. And then they're not so thrilled with that. So as we work on these solutions, we have to be mindful that for every person that we are investigating who may be a bad guy, someone else believes they're a good guy. And that person has that entitlement, that presumption of innocence in the criminal context, and that's a very powerful force in not only American law, but particularly in New York State jurisprudence. So I'll wrap it up with the thanks of the Attorney General. I encourage you to work on remedies. I encourage you to consider fraud, waste, and abuse as 3 different problems that may need 3 different remedies. Because fraud requires someone to wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to take money improperly. Waste requires someone to say, I'm going to stand there while the water tap is running, and I'm not going to tell anyone about it. And abuse fundamentally comes down to when someone says, well, no one says I can't do it, and someone's willing to come into my office and sit there while I bill for it. And those 3 issues I submit for your consideration are very different, and they require nuanced solutions to it. So thank you very much.
Our concluding presenter for panel 2 will be Dan Chan from the Office of the Chief Information Officer's Finance, Regulation, and Gaming Cluster. Dan? Okay.
Thank you. One of the benefits of being the last speaker is you learn all the talking points from the previous speakers. So I think, thank you. I learned a lot from listening to the senators. I learned a lot from listening to a gentleman from the comptroller's office. I just want to, I'm the tech guy, so to speak. So, but I try not to be too technical. What I like to do is sort of orient the audience how information technology services is organized. How many of the people in the audience is sort of familiar with OITS? Okay, all right, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details. So my responsibility, finance, regulation, and gaming, is within my cluster. I have 4 agencies that I need to make happy. The number one most important customer is the division of the budget, and then taxation and finance, Department of Financial Services, and Gaming Commission. And last night I was watching the election pretty closely, and then the outcome is that I think my workload just increased tremendously. So I'm gonna rethink a new strategy. So what I'd like to do is really. It's great to hear that there's so much passion around fraud detection. What I'd like to do today is really share with you one example that we have at Department of Taxation and Finance. You know, the techniques and the process and the people that we put in place to look at some of these, to detect some of these fraudulent activities. In particular, I would like to talk about personal income tax. If I had to ask you this question, how many returns that we process at Tax and Finance every year, what would your guess be? 10 million? Try 24. So out of these 24 million, and this sort of explained to you why Tax and Finance is so interested in investing in technology, right? When I first joined the state service, I was a CIO, so OTDA. Somebody asked a question about eligibility, integrated eligibility determination. So I lived it every day for about 4 or 5 years. So I could definitely relate to that challenge. So one thing that sort of gave me a very different perspective is how technology at Tax and Finance really make a difference. Can you imagine you had to process these 24 million returns by hands? Right, even $10 per return is economically not viable, right? So that's why the tax commissioner is so interested in investing in technology, and this is to some degree. That's why we all things considered, if you compare to some other at least executive branch agencies, I think tax and finance tend to be in the forefront of technology. So. I just started my job about 7 months ago, and as most of you know, I'm a real techie, and I love technology. When I started learning more about the capabilities and the application of the technology, and one thing that really caught my attention is really the fraud detection capabilities, right? So we have 24 million returns every year. 12 million of these returns, roughly 50% is related to personal income tax. Now, do you have any idea how many people filing their personal income tax return online? 50%, 60%, 90%. So it's a pretty high number. You think about this, right? So you sort of reflect on this and say, wow, that's interesting. If we can collect all this information electronically without, having a human touching this data, you can really collect a lot of data over a long period of time, right? So think about Google, right? They give you the free Gmail, right? You go use it. And what do they do behind the scene? They learn a lot about you. All right, so effectively, that's what we sort of did the same, similar idea, right? We make it easy for you to do filing. We make it doesn't cost you anything. Do you know that? You can go get a piece of software to do your personal income tax return. It's free. When you do a e-filing, it's free. All right, so it's pretty exciting, right? So over the years, we collected a lot of data. So once you have a lot of data, what do you do with the data? You analyze the data. And what kind of information can you get from this data? The behavior. I think somebody mentioned about this earlier. I apologize. I walked in late. So you learn about the behavior of your taxpayers, right? And what do you do once you learn about the behaviors? You sort of figure out, okay, under a certain set of circumstances, there's a good chance that this individual might not be honest in filing the return, right? So you learn from the data. You identify that those behavior, there's a certain set of outcomes, right? So now what do you do with that information? What you do is you teach the computer to figure that out on their own without having any kind of human intervention, right? It's a pretty powerful mechanism. It's a pretty powerful idea. And this is exactly what we did at Tax and Finance. And now this is sort of before my time. I think it was first introduced in 2000. I think it was late 2000s. And I want to share with you some of the outcomes, right? Are you familiar with EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit, right? From IRS perspective, they estimated somewhere between 23 and 20% of these payments are not issued properly, right? From IRS perspective. Do you know what the outcome is for New York State? Take a wild guess. With these techniques, we're able to issue payments to 93% of the people who claim this earned income tax return, right? So just to give you some idea, one, how powerful some of these techniques can be if it's done correctly. So what do you need to do in order to have this kind of level of success using technology? There are three things I think we need to think about, right? When you implement a system with this complexity or this significant investment. So I think people is the most important thing I think we need to think about, right? So this tool won't work without some of the expertise that we have around tax policies. It won't work if we don't have expertise around the business processes, right? So as a matter of fact, our next step is to take some of these tools, which are really highly sophisticated tools, and try to start training people so some of our employees can apply some of these techniques to other disciplines, right? Maybe, I think somebody mentioned earlier about learning about why people are not in compliance. Maybe they need more education. Maybe they need to raise the level of awareness. So we're going to use this sort of techniques to help us identify areas that we can do better. We can do a better job on in terms of educating taxpayers. Any of you heard about this term, data scientists? All right, so if you're looking for a new job, I think apparently, according to a McKinsey study, data scientists are going to be we're going to see it's going to be a huge demand. So in our case, we are training, we're developing a training program so we can help some of our employees develop the skills so they can look at some of these so-called big data and then start looking at collecting intelligence so we can take the appropriate action. Okay, with that, I only have 1 minute left. I'm going to wrap this up. All right, thank you.
And every once in a while, Dan, why don't you stay right there? And every once in a while, a moderator has some prerogative, and because we said that Pete was going to be a bridge, and so Pete, I'm going to ask you if you wanted to join us on the state panel as well with Senator Golden, and this could be interesting. And also Paul, if you could come up, and why don't you sit between Pete and the senator?
The same side.
Pete and I have worked together for many years.
So actually, this is a subject that so many of you have come for, how these issues that we've talked about today affect New York State government. And so rather than kicking off, for the sake of time, I'm going to open the questioning up to the floor. Questions for our panel on fraud, waste, and abuse in state government, please. And we'll wait for a second until we get the microphone to you.
Thank you. For Senator Goldman, are these audit groups part of the legislature or part of the executive function?
Say that again, please.
Are the audit groups you're talking about part of the executive function or the legislative functions? And the reason I ask is because there used to be a legislative commission on expenditure review, which was part of the legislature, which used to audit the agencies.
No, we're going to give that to the executive. This is a legislation that we're passing that the state of New York would be able to tie in all of its agencies at some point and be able to use this data mining, set up these nets that I speak of, and go across the state and get a return, whether it be on Medicaid or the Medicare fraud, on insurance fraud, auto insurance fraud, across the board.
Questions from the floor? Let me ask one while we're waiting for our questioners, and that is, we've talked a lot about the importance of detection, and it just seems that given the statistics that we've heard here today, the problem is almost too big. How much are we going to have to depend upon the private sector to assist us in the public sector in helping to root out fraud, waste, and abuse?
Okay, Peter, and I'll go
I
ahead.
think that's a good question. Obviously, the private sector is the innovator of a lot of the data mining techniques that are going on and the innovations on IT scanning and analysis. I think our ability to tap into that evolving world, I mean, this is moving very quickly. Government traditionally just doesn't move at that speed. The private sector has a vested interest in this. I tell you, I'm not all that encouraged when I hear Chris talking about the problems at the banks and the insurance companies, which I've obviously followed as a legislator and now at the Comptroller's office. People have a strong vested interest and vast resources, still haven't been able to figure out how to avoid some of the problems of identity theft and other things. I mean, the other night I got a call that somebody had used my credit card in Florida for an $8 purchase, and I was told that that's sort of a trial run. But the fact that somebody was able to detect that, I think government is just not going to be able to evolve that quickly without being able to tap into the private sector. So the private sector will be the innovator. They will bring some of the new techniques that are necessary to detect some of these cross currents the Senator's talking about among agency databases and resources, and bring them all to the fore. It's a question of how adept we are in government to be able to take advantage of those kinds of opportunities.
I pointed out earlier where the banking industry has a scanner. Somebody goes in with a scanner to get the identification of a card and to get the password, and they can do that in a matter of seconds. But the alarm in this bank will go off to let you know that that is happening, and you can stop that transaction from happening, and you can effect an arrest. Now, if that is corporate America. We need corporate America to be side by side with us. They have and have studied and have this technology available to us. Some of this technology will have to be redesigned, but in many cases, this technology is already out there. This is not reinventing the wheel. This is just working with corporate America to make sure that we got the best technology available to us to be able to go out there, do that mining, and to be able to make those arrests and to bring down those recoveries, to bring those recoveries up and bring down those arrests. But I will tell you, I'm going to go back to cigarettes for a second. Cigarette fraud. We have 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. We have investigators out there. The bad guys know that. So what do we do at 5 o'clock at night, and what do we do on the weekends? That's the problem. Insurance fraud. The insurance fraud is causing people. We've seen people die in Westchester. That one when Rose was killed in one of the scams. They get on the bus a block before the accident, and then 20 of them will get off the bus, and through no fault, everybody gets paid. And it's a scam that's hurting this state. These are the same people that are creating the Medicaid fraud, the Medicare fraud, the uninsurance fraud. And if we did the data mining to take these names and some of the names obviously are changed, but you can turn around and you can come up with addresses that are similar, names, first name, last names changed around. There's a whole host of data mining that we can do that can assist us to get done what we need to get done. And we need corporate America to help us.
Paul, Dan, anything? There's a question here in the back, and then Joe, you'll be next.
Thank you. Excellent panel. So I'm going to preface this saying that as a data miner / data scientist, I'm a huge believer in the use of technology. But I do know that no matter how good your data mining technology is, you are going to have false positives. And as a result, you might, for instance, stop legitimate claims being paid. You talked about credit cards and credit card detection, but we all have also got credit cards canceled inadvertently, incorrectly as well. So my question to you is, what is it that you can do from a legislative purpose to allow some leeway, and secondly, to educate the public so that they understand that these efforts are for their own benefits, and there might be a small cost, meaning a delay in a few legitimate payments, but by far an order of magnitude increase in the deduction of fraud?
I think the legislation can have the checks and balances in there to help, but all the checks and balances in the world are never going to help that 1 or 2 or 15 or 20 or 400 or 4,000 cases that seem to, not work out the way they should have. And I'm going to take a look at stop, question, and frisk in the city of New York. We want to do away with stop, question, and frisk. At least we did until the mayor got elected yesterday. But I would assure you that stop, question, and frisk will remain in the city of New York. It'll have maybe a different heading. It may have a different police commissioner running the police department, but there is no way that city can stay safe without doing that stop, question, and frisk. So they will redefine it, and they will do it, and they will tighten it up a little bit. And I think the same goes here. If we overstep our boundaries and we draft something that's not up to snuff, we got to go back in and we got to fix it. We do that on a regular basis here in the legislature. Believe me, we do make mistakes.
Okay. Chris, did you want to make a comment?
Well, I wanted to sort of back up what you were just talking about, false positives, which happen when you're detecting individual behavior. What the senator is talking about is getting after the group activities, which is you don't get many false positives when you got 10, 15, 20 people all doing the same thing at the same time. So the scheme that you're talking about really goes a long ways to addressing the false positive issue, because you're not detecting individual behavior as much as you are focusing on group behavior.
Well, that's why I pointed out the stop, question, and frisk, because that is individual, and sometimes you do see the individual that anomaly that comes up and pops up, and that person should not have been arrested. So that's why I pointed that out as being part of it.
If I could just tap on this, I think some of these kinds of questions might be very appropriate for the pilot, right? So looking if in fact the legislation does go forward and the pilot goes forward, this idea of what about these ethical issues, what about the false positives, what are the policy frameworks that need to be changed? Not just does the technology allow us to pull the data together to do these things, but what are the implications of the new insight that we now have? Does the policy limit us from using it? Do we need new ways to organize our agencies to actually leverage the data into new actions? Are there ideas with respect to the pilot to be looking at these sort of larger ethical organizational societal issues?
I believe it's already going on in many of the different agencies across this country. It's just a matter of taking it and allowing us to get into the silos and use the legislation that's already available to us. So you want to add to that?
I would say on one of the challenges we will face in New York going forward in whatever model is the differentiation of the programs. We heard about this earlier. There's, as you were speaking, if we have 20 different definitions of gender, that's a challenge. In the Medicaid field, we've never had positive Medicaid recipient ID. We have recipient ID cards, but they are certainly not foolproof. We have no for example, provider ID system. So in many of our cases, our challenge is simply that a particular provider's Medicaid number was used on a claim, but that does not mean that that individual provider stood there while that claim was entered. And with the bad guys, as I talk about it, it's always the fault of the girl at the front desk. This girl has cost the state millions and millions of dollars every year because she always puts the wrong person's name in. The doctor cashed the check, but didn't authorize the billing. And so I think we have to do a lot of work at the fundamental framework of what is our entry point to making a claim against state funds in the first place, and we have to work on rationalizing that.
There are so many access points to answer that question. I mean, one, and I don't want to take issue with the Attorney General's office, but to build a case takes a long time. And while that long time plays out, the fraud continues. And we've had difficulties, obviously, and they do too. I mean, the rules of the criminal prosecution rules, take a long time to play through to the point where an indictment is brought and then activity is stopped.
That's Peter supporting that legislation, I think. What do you think? Does that sound like that?
There are other issues. There are other issues. We offered to work with the executive on a data matching system. When we thought this was a good idea, just what the panelists are talking about, it being able to match up with other agencies' data, and that didn't go anywhere. I mean, that's just a question of somebody picking up the phone. I mean, awful lot of these big agencies answer to the governor, and directions to the agencies to the extent that it's legal to share data and to engage in a discussion, a collaborative approach to using the vast amounts of data. We harbor in our agency huge amounts of data, as do the tax department, the health department, and all the other big Department of Labor, you name it, DMV. I mean, a simple direction from the executive to work on a data matching protocol could go a long way to try to start this process. I mean, it's not going to be the end, but it's certainly going to undo the silos. And that doesn't take legislation, I don't think, Senator. I think that just takes a direction or an understanding of the value of that kind of activity and a direction from the executive to try to work out a protocol to make that happen.
I believe you do need legislation. I think that to get that done is going to take legislation in the state of New York, and I think the governor would go along with it, but I think it's legislation. Okay. And there were many presenters here today that did well, not many, but a couple of you that put up the Oceana or the Tiana complex in Brighton Beach as one of the areas where there is significant fraud. What I would ask you to do in the future is to actually take a picture of the Oceana or Tiana and actually put it up there. This is an exclusive condominium, condo facility, I would say over 400 condos at this unit. You can't get in there. You can't get past the main gate. You are stopped. This is all high-end. This is a very lucrative, very nice complex to live, and 99% of the people that live in that facility are good, tax-paying, hard-working doctors, lawyers, bankers. But that 1% or 2% that are in that building are causing billions of dollars of fraud across this state.
Michelle, we have one more question in the third row. Joe?
Thank you, Senator Morgan. I'm a field investigator for fraud, and I see where you're going, and I appreciate what you're doing. And it's not about I or me, it's about we and us. And if we come together and there's teamwork, we can get the job done. And I appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for all of our panelists. I'd like to thank our organizers from CTG, and Teresa, thank you so much for your support in this program, and to Brian as well, and to Sass and Sean for coming up, and Jim, I know that there's a Krista, I know there's a connection, and also to Ariel, who really got this whole thing started. It's been a wonderful panel, and I would be remiss if I did not thank our own staff for the wonderful work that they do, and they always do, to make these programs possible. We will have a series of panels coming up that we are in development on, and if we do not yet have your email address, please leave your business card, because we'd like to add you to our files and let you know when our programs are coming up. That concludes today's program. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.